So for this project, I chose to study the Anglican Church of North America. I've grown up and have been a part of a Baptist church all my life, so a lot of what we learned in this class was brand new material for me. The very first time I've been exposed to some of it. I knew right off the bat in the first lesson that we had about the differences in creeds and confessions that I'd really enjoyed the class, but that a lot of the content would be very foreign to me. So I wanted to try to study a tradition that would help me understand those really more. Um, so I decided I wanted to study a tradition that I was at least a little bit familiar with and who held to the ecumenical creeds in some sort of liturgical structure. So I have some friends that I went to college with that have since gone on to Anglican churches. So I at least knew I could talk to them a little bit about their church and why they did what they did. So I studied three main churches. I studied the Grace Anglican Church in Florida, Trinity Anglican Mission in Atlanta, and then the main church that I studied was St. Thomas Anglican Church in Athens, Georgia, which is the city I'm in here in Athens. So I'm just going to go through the questions and answer them. First one was, what core rituals or practices are the most influential in forming the beliefs and religious practices of the group? Well, churches in the ACNA, the Anglican Church in North America, follow the Book of Common Prayer, where their rituals and practices are, for the most part at least, prescribed for them. Their services are centered around the Word and table, and they kind of form two large movements in their Sunday gatherings. They have prayers of confessions, readings from the Word of God, short homilies, and then other prayers of thanksgiving and various topics, like for the sick or for military personnel or whoever. And then they also celebrate the Eucharist. And they have prayers and readings and such that surround that as well. So all the services I watched required a lot of participation from the worshipers in responsive readings and then in the prayers also. They also follow what they consider to be the great tradition of the church's calendar. So they follow the Christmas and Easter cycles, beginning with Christmas, Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, and then Lent, Easter, and Pentecost. These cycles help them determine their greetings and prayers that they use in their actual services. It also determines much of their art elements, like their collars, music, things like that. One of the churches I looked at, Trinity Anglican Mission in Atlanta, they especially are very artsy in what they do, a large arts culture in their church. And their pastor described the church calendar, and what it does for them is something that sets the general mood for the church for those specific seasons. So all the music they use for Lent, for example, would be maybe a little slower, a little bit more reflective, meditative, where in Easter it may be a lot more celebratory, as opposed to lots of songs about confession or repentance or whatever. Second question, how do the documents and teachings of your group help individual members express their love for God and fellow human beings? Well, the idea behind the Book of Common Prayer and using a set liturgy every week is that the worshipers are formed and transformed through their repeated practices. In other words, they depend on the ritual to actually form them into people who express love for God and their neighbors. So they don't just hear what they do and then go out and do it. They're actually formed into that person in their worship gatherings. Their services include prescribed prayers for those in need, also for missions, again, forms them into that type of person. They also see communion as an act of unification that requires the worshipers to be in good standings with each other. It's kind of an implied thing that when you take communion with the church, that you are in good standing with the church. So if you were to fall under something like church discipline, for example, you would not be able to take communion as part of the church. Next question, how do cultural and denominational preferences strengthen or weaken how the members of the group express their faith and Christian identity? Well, as far as denominational preferences, they are an Episcopalian type of church leadership. So that's very foreign from what I know as a Baptist. But one key idea is that each individual member would see themselves as part of this larger church that reaches beyond their own time and place. So it reaches beyond their one service time and beyond their one location. They're part of something bigger than just what they do. So, for example, St. Thomas Anglican Church here in Athens, even though they may meet at a time that's technically different than what the Anglican Church met at like 50 years ago, they see themselves as part of that one same thing. Different time and place, but what they do and who they are expands way beyond just their one meeting time and their one meeting place. They're a part of something much, much larger than that. One strength, I think, is that their sacramental view of time helps them understand that their identity is larger than themselves. It's something bigger than just them and their own cultural expression, whatever that local church may be. There's a lot of disagreement or varying beliefs about specific doctrines because they're part of a tradition that spans across time and space. Therefore, they span across many different cultural expressions and beliefs. The Apostles' and Athanasian creeds they hold to allow them to be very broad in their teaching, even. Um, the Church Trinity Anglican Mission in Atlanta specifically, I felt like they were able to take advantage of that a lot more. They were able to speak to a lot more people, and they were able to fit in a lot of different cultural expressions in their worship gatherings because they saw themselves as something larger than themselves. It wasn't something they had to just teach through to their church. This is why we do this, or this is why we do. It was just kind of a given that they are bigger than just their one ethnic group or cultural expression or whatever. So that when they had a guest group come in, maybe to do a type of music that wasn't natural to what you might hear in Atlanta or church in Atlanta, it fit into who they were and what they did because they naturally understand themselves to be larger than just one thing. I think one weakness, though, could be the very reason that the ACNA exists in the first place. The ACNA began in a lot of ways as a split from and a response to the Episcopal Church's liberal theology and practices. And the pastor I talked to, St. Thomas Anglican here in Athens, he didn't grow up Anglican either, but he explained that a lot of people are coming to that tradition, specifically the ACNA, from other denominations or other groups because they are a more Catholic expression of the church, but they're broad in their theology, but they're also conservative. Just generally speaking, the ACNA is perceived to be a lot more conservative than the Episcopal Church here in America. So a lot of people come to the ACNA from other traditions because of those reasons, and one of the big ones is because they are, on purpose, a little bit more conservative. So I think that's a weakness and something that's kind of ingrained into who they are. They exist because they could not reconcile with the Episcopal Church's teachings, and I assume there'll come a time when the ACNA will need to reconcile with the reasons they split. Whether that's at a time when they face other questions or, for whatever reason, I think they're gonna have to come to grips with that of why they are what they are. So what can the Reformed tradition learn from the teachings and practices in this group, and what can the Reformed tradition teach this group? I think one thing every tradition can learn from the ACNA or really any Catholic expression like them is their sacramental understanding of the world. This was a huge paradigm shift for me, especially going through the Common Book of Prayer. I actually ordered a Book of Common Prayer when we started this project because my friend here told me that you really have to learn from the inside. So I did practice the daily office just about every day for quite a while through the course of this project, just to try to get in the mind of somebody on the inside of an ACNA church. And their sacramental understanding of the world, I think, is a huge key, a huge reason of why they do what they do. I think especially as many churches and traditions use more liturgical elements in their worship gatherings, I think the reason or the mind behind their liturgy and their understanding of time is really important. In other words, they follow a prescribed liturgy and are slow to make changes with things like language and the way they use the calendar because of their sacramental foundation. I think for churches that are wanting to use more liturgical elements, they should not do so without considering some of the reasoning behind their decisions. So if a church isn't ready, for example, to think about a sacramental view of time or ready to grapple with that at some level, I think it would be a mistake just to head straight head on into the church calendar and just follow it completely. But at the same time, I think a church that is wanting to move in that direction could benefit from looking at time sacramentally, and there's just some mutual benefication that can happen there. I think the Reformed tradition can teach the ACNA a lot about the idea of constantly evaluating and course correcting. The idea that no one person or prayer book can fully summarize and give a good direction for the church over the course of all time would fit well with their sacramental understanding of time. The Reformed Church understands its confessional documents to be further clarifications on earlier creeds and confessions. And a church like the ACNA, especially considering their beginning, might benefit from thinking about more recent confessions in this way. In other words, even though they hold to the Apostles' Creed and the Athanasian Creed, I think maybe forming other confessional documents on their own to help give clarification as to what they mean or why they can hold to that, and also other Episcopalian churches, but they're a little bit different, or the reason they started is because of different disagreements. I think just some clarification in their confessional documents would help them understand their own identity even a little bit more. So I really enjoyed studying the ACNA. I learned a lot. I think the biggest things I learned were the sacramental understanding and how important that is for why they do what they do.